When it comes to external partners, as I mentioned before, there's over 40 different countries and institutions that play a key sort of donor and support role with the AU. Just to highlight, I think for me, the most important four of those. First and foremost, by a long way, I think the most significant, deepest, broadest partnership is with the United Nations. And that's been particularly the case when thinking about how the UN can support African-led peace operations. The big program here has been the UN's 10-year capacity building program to help the African Union develop its peace and security capabilities. That's now just coming to an end, and so we need to think about what shape and format will the UN's partnership continue with the AU. But I think it's also important, as we heard again on the previous panel, there's been a shift in the rhetoric, importantly, from capacity building to engaging in strategic partnerships. And I think that's a key takeaway from the UN in its relations with the AU now. It's not just trying to build it's not just trying to build capabilities in a sort of lacking institution. It's trying to figure out how a strategic partnership should work and look between a roughly or more important partner. The key to my mind in this partnership has been the creation of the UN's Office of the African Union in Addis Ababa, established in 2010 but was up and running in 2011. And this is an office of about 80 or so UN employees who are based permanently in Addis Ababa and work most closely with the African Union, helping with the planning and support and management of AU-led peace operations. Here, I think this has been very important in helping build positive atmospherics by doing two main things, I think. One is that UNOAU has done a good job of trying to explain New York politics to Addis Ababa. And it's also doing a pretty good job, I think, of explaining Addis Ababa's politics to New York at the UN Security Council, because a lot of the problems with the UN and AU relationship previously had come from, I think, not just misunderstanding, but genuine frustration and sometimes ignorance about how the UN Security Council makes decisions versus how the African Union's Peace and Security Council makes decisions. The second big partnership I think that's been key is with the European Union, and particularly the European Union's Africa Peace Facility, which was set up in 2004. It's now put just under 2 billion euros into various African peace and security activities. The biggest slice of that change, if you like, has been funding the allowances for the personnel in the African Union mission in Somalia. But I think a couple of things to say importantly about the EU relationship. First of all, it's multilateral to multilateral, obviously. There's not many other multilateral institutions that put a lot of money directly into the African Union at the multilateral level. Secondly, it's been a predictable source of funding because the EU bases its programs on at least 3-year funding cycles, so it gives a bit more predictability to what's happening. But of course, it's fundamentally rooted in the European Union's development programs, and so the EU is limited quite significantly when it comes to providing more sort of military and lethal types of security assistance to the AU, which means it needs other forms of partners to work in this area. And here I think the US relationship, but also, as we've heard already from Ambassador Shin, France and the UK and some other bilateral states are important. But the US, obviously, since we signed in particular in 2010 an agreement with the African Union, of which peace and security issues were part of that, I think the US has been the third sort of key partnership here. I would just flag up initially that I think we're still relatively at the small and early stage of figuring out how to engage the African Union as a multilateral institution rather than engaging the 54 African Union members bilaterally. We are set up more bureaucratically, financially, in terms of funding authorities, pretty much in terms of everything, to engage bilaterally, and not so well, I think, equipped to engage multilaterally. And I think we could learn a few lessons from how the EU has done this. And fourth, as we just heard already, China's cooperation with the AU is just starting in the last few years to come into the peace and security realm much more than it has done in previous years. I think my main takeaway on that at the moment is that China is starting to grapple with exactly the same headaches and challenges that all those other partners have been grappling with for the last few years. And what I mean by that is if China wants to invest, let's say, $300 million in supporting the African peace and security architecture, it's not immediately clear or obvious where that means you should spend your money to get the best and most effective outcomes. And I think China is grappling in a way that everybody else is.